The Anglophone Anarchists. Part 2. Lysander Spooner. Lysander Spooner was a thinker who rivaled Josiah Warren in originality, but who excelled him in logical acumen and clarity of expression. A lawyer by training and by instinct, he was a master not only of logic but also of rhetoric. This combination of logical rigour with rhetorical invective is truly stimulating, even today, some 150 years after he wrote. Spooner has a simple theory of justice. It is essentially a version of the classic conception of justice as rendering to others what is their due. What, then, are the elements of justice for Spooner? Negatively, as one might expect, justice enjoins us not to steal from another or to rob another or otherwise to interfere with another's property. Likewise, one may not, in justice, assault or kill another. Are these the sum total of our just obligations? No. There may be some positive ones, but these, as will be seen, all depend on prior commitments. We cannot acquire them without doing something. So, for example, we have an obligation to pay our debts, and to return borrowed property, and to make reparations for injury. Of course, if we haven't contracted any debts, or borrowed any property, or caused any injury to another, then we have no positive obligations to discharge in justice. Spooner remarks, "So long as these conditions are fulfilled, men are at peace and ought to remain at peace with each other." Of course, human life is not only a matter of justice. We may believe that we have obligations that go beyond justice, obligations to relieve the distress of others, to feed the hungry, and to clothe the naked. But Spooner contends such obligations are moral obligations, not obligations of justice, and so are not amenable to any form of physical compulsion. We may be compelled by force, if necessary, to do our legal duties, that is, duties in justice. But while others may attempt to persuade us to fulfill our moral obligations, they may not use force to achieve their ends. A man may choose to pursue his just deserts by himself, or, if he so chooses, to associate with or to employ others for that purpose. He may not, however, be forced to accept another's assistance if he does not desire to do so. Such associations can be rightful and desirable only insofar as they are purely voluntary. No man can rightfully be coerced into joining one or supporting one against his will. If he chooses to depend for the protection of his own rights solely upon himself, and upon such voluntary assistance as other persons may freely offer to him when the necessity for it arise, he has a perfect right to do so. In what will become a standard theme in libertarian literature, Spooner makes the point that there is no principal difference between various forms of association for mutual assistance. An association for mutual protection against injustice is like an association for mutual protection against fire or shipwreck. And there is no more right or reason in compelling any man to join or support one of these associations against his will, his judgment, or his conscience, than there is in compelling him to join or support any other, whose benefits, if it offer any, he does not want, or whose purposes or methods he does not approve. The basic principles of natural law and natural justice are, Spooner thinks, easily known. So easily known that children acquire them without difficulty. Human beings come to know this natural law long before they have learned the meanings of the words by which we describe it. Natural law is implicit in human practice before ever it is reflectively appropriated in thought. Unless there be such a thing as natural justice, and unless it exists by nature and not merely by convention, there can be no crime. Absent natural justice, and what appear to be crimes are events in the world like the falling of the rain or the sighing of the breeze. Conversely, if we recognize some actions as criminal, then this way of understanding them is either purely conventional and subject to arbitrary, sometimes radical alteration, or these actions are always and everywhere a violation of some natural principle of justice. The rights corresponding to justice, the right not to be assaulted or to be robbed or to be murdered, belong to man simply as man. They cannot be given to a man or taken from him, nor can he give them away. They are imprescriptible and inalienable. Laws that are the product of a legislature either give effect to natural justice, in either its positive or negative form, or they do not. If they do, that is well and good. If not, it is an assumption of authority and dominion where no right of authority or dominion exists. It is therefore simply and always an intrusion, an absurdity, an usurpation, and a crime. If natural justice is easily known, universal, and the rights associated with it inalienable and imprescriptible, what need have we of legislation? The short answer is none. Nevertheless, legislation we have, and in abundance. Why? Spooner's answer is simple and stark. Whenever society has advanced so that it produces more than the mere means of subsistence, some group of people have associated and organized themselves as robbers to plunder and enslave all others who had either accumulated any property that could be seized or had shown by their labour that they could be made to contribute to the support or pleasure of those who should enslave them. This theft and enslavement was institutionalized in the form of governments and enforced by the making of laws. The laws thus made by these bands of robbers have no more real obligation than have the agreements which brigands, bandits and pirates find it necessary to enter into with each other, for the more successful accomplishment of their crimes and the more peaceable division of their spoils. Legislation, then, is the means by which the few hold the many in a state of subjection, and have done so ever since states came into being. Spooner's distinction between the realms of law, which deals with crime, and morality, which concerns itself with virtues and vices, is the subject of a treatise entitled, not surprisingly, Vices Are Not Crimes. Vices, Spooner says, are those acts by which a man harms himself or his property. Crimes are those acts by which one man harms the person or property of another. For Spooner, and for libertarians generally, it is vitally important to make and maintain this distinction. To treat vices as crimes and to punish them accordingly is to infringe the vicious person's rights, property, or liberty. If all vices were punished as crimes, then everyone would be in prison, with no one outside to lock the prison door. If, on the other hand, only some vices are treated as crimes, what will serve as the basis for such an arbitrary distinction? Will the members of a legislature pass laws against the vices of others while ignoring their own? Suitably authorized agencies have the right to punish crimes because they are the delegates of individuals who also have that right. But as no individual has the right to punish the vices of another, so no group can have the right delegated to them. Against Spooner's position that governments are merely robbers who have acquired a veneer of respectability, it will be argued that they are legitimate inasmuch as their authority rests on the consent of the governed. In response, Spooner would argue that the authority of a government cannot be simply a matter of numbers, otherwise any group of people, x plus delta, could claim to govern any group of people of size x. I cannot lawfully dispose of your property or person, and I still could not do so lawfully, even if all those who lived in my community agreed with my attempted disposition. But you did not. To make the legitimacy of a government to be a matter of a majority is to rest it upon a contest between two groups of men. Even were it to be the case that governments have, if not the enthusiastic support, at least the acquiescence of the many, why should that matter? Spooner writes, men are dunces for uniting to sustain any government or any laws except those in which they are all agreed. Perhaps it could be argued against Spooner that we are a nation, and the nation has a right to determine its own activities, and it can do so only by legislation. This objection, of course, raises the question, what is a nation, and how do nations come to be? How is it, asks Spooner, that each of many millions of men comes to be stripped of all his natural God-given rights, and to be incorporated, compressed, compacted, and consolidated into a mass with other men, whom he never saw, with whom he has no contract, and towards many of whom he has no sentiments but fear, hatred, and contempt? If a nation, and the government by which it is directed, is to exist by right at all, then it can only do so by consent. Well, it might be said, at least in the case of the USA, there is such consent, and it is manifested in and through the US Constitution. Spooner has no doubt that the US Constitution purports to be a contract embodying consent. He believes, in fact, that the only way to conceive of that Constitution in such a way that it would have legal effect is for it to be a contract of some kind. It has no authority, he says, or obligation at all, unless as a contract between man and man. Although he believes that the US Constitution is a much better document than it is generally taken to be, he argues vigorously against its being acceptable, or its being in fact accepted. Spooner's thesis is absolutely clear. He writes, "The Constitution has no inherent authority or obligation." If the US Constitution is a contract, who are the parties to it? Spooner remarks, "The Constitution does not so much as even purport to be a contract between persons now existing. It purports at most to be only a contract between persons living 80 years ago." According to Spooner, only those people who were actually around when it was approved could possibly be candidates for such a position. Does that mean that all the people living in the USA 80 years before Spooner wrote are to be taken to be parties to the Constitution? No. Only those people legally entitled and competent to make contracts among those alive at the time are in the running, but not even all of these were, in fact, parties to the Constitution, for, as Spooner notes, we know historically that only a small portion even of the people then existing were consulted on the subject or asked or permitted to express either their consent or dissent in any formal manner. He points out that the number of people who actually consented to the Constitution of the USA was not very numerous. Women and African Americans were excluded, property qualifications excluded anywhere from 1/2 to 3/4 of the white male adults, and of the remaining small amount of potentially qualified voters, how many actually exercised their franchise? Spooner examines the opening lines of the US Constitution and asks, who the we in "we, the people of the United States, ... is meant to be. He replies that it can only mean individuals acting freely and voluntarily. Such authority as the document has, it has only between those who actually consented. He invites us to imagine another, rather less grandiose agreement, in which we might say, we, the people of Philadelphia, agree to maintain a school for ourselves and our children. Such an agreement would, of course, be binding only on those who actually agreed, and any attempt to compel those who had not consented to contribute to the maintenance of the school would be a form of extortion. References to posterity cannot be taken to imply that there was any intention or any acknowledgement of a right or power to bind posterity. According to Spooner, those who actually consented to the Constitution, whatever their number may have been, only bound themselves and no others. Still further, even those who explicitly consented did not bind themselves forever, for no time element is mentioned. According to Spooner, this makes it merely an association during pleasure, even between the original consenting parties. Since the original parties to the purported contract, that is the Constitution, were no longer alive in 1870 when Spooner was writing, he believes it follows that the Constitution, so far as it was their contract, died with them. They had no power or right to make it obligatory upon their children. It is not only plainly impossible in the nature of things that they could bind their posterity, but they did not even attempt to bind them. If posterity wasn't bound by those who established the Constitution, have they somehow bound themselves? Well, clearly, they could bind themselves by explicit ratification. Failing that, are there any other ways in which they might do so? What of the claim that voting in a political system implies de facto consent to that system? Spooner writes, without his consent having ever been asked, a man finds himself environed by a government that he cannot resist, a government that forces him to pay money, render service, and forego the exercise of many of his natural rights, under peril of weighty punishments. he sees too that other men practice this tyranny over him by the use of the ballot. He sees further that if he will but use the ballot himself, he has some chance of relieving himself from this tyranny of others by subjecting them to his own. In short, he finds himself, without his consent, so situated that if he use the ballot he may become a master. If he does not use it, he must become a slave. And he has no other alternative than these two. In self-defense, he attempts the former. His case is analogous to that of a man who has been forced into battle, where he must either kill others or be killed himself. Because to save his own life in battle, a man attempts to take the life of his opponents, it is not to be inferred that the battle is one of his choosing. Neither in contest with the ballot, which is a mere substitute for a bullet, because as his only chance of self-preservation, a man uses the ballot, is it to be inferred that the contest is one into which he voluntarily entered. Only if the act of voting is truly voluntary could a person be said to support the Constitution under which he votes. But for many people it is not voluntary. It is a necessity or a matter of self-defense. Some vote to have some small say in the disposition of the money that is taken from them in taxes. Were such taxation not to occur, they wouldn't have any inclination to vote. To take a man's property without his consent, and then to infer his consent because he attempts by voting to prevent that property being used to his injury, is a very insufficient proof of his consent to support the Constitution. On the related matter of taxation, as an indication of tacit consent, Spooner writes, "No attempt or pretence that was ever carried into practical operation among civilized men, unless possibly the pretence of a divine right on the part of some to govern and enslave others, embodied so much shameless absurdity, falsehood, impudence, robbery, usurpation, tyranny, and villainy of every kind, as the attempt or pretence of establishing a government by consent, and getting the actual consent of only so many as may be necessary to keep the rest in subjection by force. Such a government is a mere conspiracy of the strong against the weak. It no more rests on consent than does the worst government on earth. What substitute for their consent is offered to the weaker party, whose rights are thus annihilated, struck out of existence by the stronger? Only this: their consent is presumed. As well might the highwayman pretend to justify himself by presuming that the traveller consents to part with his money. As well might the assassin justify himself by simply presuming that his victim consents to part with his life. As well might the holder of chattel slaves attempt to justify himself by presuming that they consent to his authority and to the whips and the robbery which he practices upon them. The presumption is simply a presumption that the weaker party consent to be slaves. Taxes, being compulsory, provide no evidence that taxpayers support the Constitution. Spooner compares the tax collector unfavourably to a highwayman. The highwayman takes solely upon himself the responsibility, danger, and crime of his own act. He doesn't pretend that he has any rightful claim to your money, or that he intends to use it for your own benefit. He does not pretend to be anything but a robber. He has not acquired impudence enough to profess to be merely a protector, and that he takes men's money against their will merely to enable him to protect those infatuated travellers who feel perfectly able to protect themselves, or do not appreciate his peculiar system of protection. He is too sensible a man to make such professions as these. Furthermore, having taken your money, he leaves you as you wish him to. He does not persist in following you on the road against your will, assuming to be your rightful sovereign, on account of the protection he affords you. He doesn't keep protecting you by commanding you to bow down and serve him, by requiring you to do this, and forbidding you to do that, by robbing you of more money as often as he finds it in his interest or pleasure to do, or by branding you as a rebel, traitor, and an enemy to your country, and shooting you down without mercy if you dispute his authority or resist his demands. He is too much of a gentleman to be guilty of such imposture and insults and villainies as these. Spooner makes the even more radical claim that not only does the Constitution not bind anyone now, but that it never did bind anyone. He makes much of the fact that no one signed the document, and that the general principle of law and reason is that a written instrument doesn't bind until and unless it is signed. he instances the formalization of wills and deeds, and the requirement that they be signed, sealed, witnessed, and acknowledged. He then says, "And yet we have what purports or professes, or is claimed to be a contract, the Constitution, made 80 years ago by men who are now all dead, and who never had any power to bind us, but which, it is claimed, has nevertheless bound 3 generations of men, consisting of many millions, and which, it is claimed, will be binding upon all the millions that are to come, but which nobody ever signed, sealed, delivered, witnessed, or acknowledged, and which few persons, compared with the whole number that are claimed to be bound by it, have ever read, or even seen, or ever will read or see. And of those who ever have read it, or ever will read it, scarcely any two, perhaps no two, have ever agreed or ever will agree as to what it means." Spooner concludes that despite its pretensions, the US Constitution is not a contract, that it binds nobody, and it never did bind anybody, and that those who claim to act by its authority are acting without authority. There is nothing to stop anyone who thinks the Constitution to be worthwhile actually signing it and agreeing with others who do likewise that they will make laws for each other within its remit, allowing non-signers to live in peace. Appearances to the contrary notwithstanding, the government of the USA does not in fact rest upon any consent of the people of the USA. On the contrary, the only visible, tangible, responsible government that exists is that of a few individuals only, who act in concert and call themselves by the several names of senators, representatives, presidents, judges, marshals, treasurers, collectors, generals, colonels, captains, etc., etc.